What if I told you that ancient Egypt wasn't just endless sand dunes and pyramids, but actually a thriving green oasis that was called the Gift of the Nile for good reason? Picture this. You're standing on the banks of the Nile River around 1400 BCE during the height of the New Kingdom. Instead of the barren desert landscape you might expect, you're surrounded by lush green fields stretching as far as the eye can see, dotted with palm trees swaying in the breeze. Farmers are working in flooded fields, their feet squelching in the rich black mud that the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land. This fertile soil, deposited annually by the Nile's floods, was so different from the red desert sand beyond that the Egyptians saw their world as literally divided between life and death, green abundance and barren wasteland. The Nile River was the absolute lifeline of ancient Egypt, flowing over 4,000 miles from the highlands of Ethiopia and Uganda down to the Mediterranean Sea. Every summer, like clockwork, the river would swell with monsoon rains and melting snow from the Ethiopian highlands, spilling over its banks and flooding the entire Nile Valley. When the waters receded, they left behind a layer of incredibly fertile silt that made Egypt one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. The Egyptians were so dependent on this annual miracle that they organized their entire calendar around it, dividing the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, the flooding season; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. The landscape of ancient Egypt was a narrow ribbon of green cutting through an ocean of desert. The fertile area rarely extended more than 10 miles from the river on either side, creating a dramatic contrast that would have been visible even from space. The Egyptians called this fertile zone the Black Land, while the surrounding desert was the Red Land. This wasn't just a geographical distinction, but a spiritual one. The Black Land represented life, fertility, and rebirth, while the Red Land was associated with chaos, death, and the god Set. Yet even the desert played a crucial role in Egyptian civilization, providing valuable minerals, serving as a natural barrier against invasion, and offering a pathway to trade routes that connected Egypt with Nubia, the Levant, and beyond. The most striking feature of the Egyptian landscape would have been the incredible abundance of wildlife. The Nile River and its surrounding marshes teemed with life that seems almost unimaginable today. Hippos wallowed in the river's shallows, so numerous that they were considered a major hazard to river travel. Crocodiles basked on the muddy banks, some growing to enormous sizes and becoming objects of both fear and worship. The river was thick with fish of dozens of species, from massive Nile perch to smaller species that formed the backbone of the Egyptian diet. In the papyrus marshes that bordered the river, you would have found ibises, herons, pelicans, and countless other water birds. These weren't just background scenery, but integral parts of Egyptian life and religion. The ibis was sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom. The falcon represented Horus, the sky god. And the crocodile was venerated as Sobek, the fearsome deity of the Nile's power. Egyptian cities rose like islands from this green landscape, each with its own distinct character and purpose. Memphis, the ancient capital during the Old Kingdom, sprawled along the Nile's west bank, near the apex of the delta. The city was dominated by massive temples and the pharaoh's palace, but it was also a bustling commercial center where merchants from across the known world came to trade. The streets would have been alive with the sounds of craftsmen hammering metal, potters spinning their wheels, and vendors calling out their wares. Narrow alleys wound between flat-roofed houses made of mud brick, painted in whites and ochres, with small courtyards where families gathered in the evening cool. Thebes, the great southern capital during the New Kingdom, was perhaps even more impressive. The city stretched along both banks of the Nile, connected by ferries and bordered by some of the most magnificent temples ever built. On the east bank stood the vast temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, their towering pylons and columns visible from miles away. These weren't just religious sites, but economic powerhouses that controlled vast estates and employed thousands of workers. The West Bank was the realm of the dead, where the valleys of the kings held the tombs of pharaohs, and the mortuary temples of dead rulers dominated the desert cliffs. Yet even this city of the dead was very much alive, bustling with tomb builders, priests, embalmers, and pilgrims. The Nile Delta, where the river split into multiple channels before reaching the Mediterranean, was a world unto itself. This triangular region was a maze of waterways, islands, and fertile fields that the Greeks would later compare to their own river deltas. Here, the landscape was even more lush and green than the Nile Valley, with papyrus marshes stretching to the horizon and countless villages built on elevated mounds to stay above the floodwaters. The delta was Egypt's gateway to the Mediterranean world, and its ports bustled with ships from Greece, Phoenicia, and other trading partners. Agriculture dominated the Egyptian landscape in a way that's hard to imagine in our modern world. During flood season, much of the valley floor would be underwater, turning the entire region into a vast temporary lake, dotted with villages and cities that seemed to float like islands. Farmers would use this time to repair their tools, engage in crafts, or work on royal building projects. When the floods receded, the real work began. Teams of men would break up the soft, mud-covered earth with wooden plows pulled by oxen, then plant seeds of wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. The resulting fields created a patchwork of different crops that would change color throughout the growing season, from the bright green of new growth to the golden hues of ripening grain. The irrigation systems that supported this agriculture were marvels of ancient engineering. Networks of canals, dikes, and basins channeled and controlled the floodwaters, allowing farmers to keep their fields moist long after the river had returned to its normal level. These systems required constant maintenance and coordination among thousands of farmers, creating a need for strong central authority that helped give rise to pharaonic power. Village chiefs and regional governors spent much of their time organizing work crews to dig new canals, repair old ones, and settle disputes over water rights. Egyptian houses reflected the environment in which they were built. Most homes were made of mud brick, a logical choice in a land where stone was precious, but mud was abundant after every flood. These bricks were made by mixing Nile mud with straw, forming them in wooden molds and leaving them to dry in the desert sun. The resulting buildings were surprisingly cool and comfortable, with thick walls that kept out the heat and flat roofs that served as additional living space. Wealthier families might have houses with multiple stories, courtyards with pools or gardens, and walls decorated with colorful paintings of birds, plants, and geometric designs. The wealthy lived in villas that were like small versions of paradise. These homes featured extensive gardens with ponds stocked with fish and lotus flowers, groves of fruit trees including dates, figs, pomegranates, and grapes, and vegetable plots that provided fresh food year-round. Archaeological evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, shows us that even working-class Egyptians lived in comfortable homes with multiple rooms, built-in storage areas, and small shrines to household gods. The contrast with the simple huts and tents of many other ancient peoples would have been striking. Markets and commercial areas added their own character to Egyptian cities. Picture the harbors along the Nile, where dozens of boats of all sizes would be moored. Sleek royal barges with gilded prows and colorful sails shared space with sturdy cargo vessels loaded with grain, stone blocks for building projects, or luxury goods from distant lands. Smaller fishing boats and papyrus skiffs darted between the larger vessels like water bugs. The docks themselves would be piled high with goods, amphora of wine and oil, bundles of papyrus, carved ivory, precious metals, exotic animals, and spices that filled the air with unfamiliar scents. The desert beyond the Green Valley wasn't empty wasteland, but served crucial purposes in Egyptian civilization. Here were the quarries where workers extracted the limestone, sandstone, granite, and other stones used in Egypt's magnificent monuments. The desert was also home to gold mines, particularly in the Eastern Desert and Nubia, which provided much of the wealth that funded Egypt's building projects and international trade. Caravans of donkeys and later camels would trek across these harsh landscapes, following routes marked by wells and oases, carrying precious cargo between the Nile Valley and distant lands. Religion permeated every aspect of the Egyptian landscape. Temples weren't just buildings, but complex estates that might include workshops, granaries, cattle pens, and housing for hundreds of priests and workers. The largest temples, like Karnak, were essentially cities within cities, with their own harbors, libraries, and administrative centers. These sacred spaces were designed to represent the cosmos in miniature, with their progression from outer courtyards to inner sanctuaries mirroring the journey from the mortal world to the realm of the gods. Sacred animals were everywhere in the Egyptian landscape. Bulls, cats, ibises, crocodiles, and many other creatures were not just wild animals, but living embodiments of divine power. Some temples maintained sacred herds or flocks, while others kept individual animals that were worshipped as gods incarnate. The famous Apis bull of Memphis lived in luxury in a special temple complex and was mourned like a pharaoh when it died. Even domestic animals had religious significance. Cats were sacred to the goddess Bastet, while cattle were associated with several deities, including Hathor. The changing seasons brought dramatic transformations to the Egyptian landscape. During the flood season, much of the valley would be transformed into a vast lake, with only cities, villages, and elevated roads remaining above water. This was a time of relative leisure when people could focus on crafts, festivals, and family life. As the waters receded, teams of workers would emerge to repair irrigation channels and prepare fields for planting. The growing season saw the entire valley turn green with crops, while the harvest season brought frantic activity as everyone worked to gather the grain before the next flood arrived. Egyptian gardens were works of art that revealed the civilization's sophisticated understanding of horticulture and aesthetics. The wealthy created elaborate pleasure gardens with geometric layouts, ornamental pools, and careful arrangements of trees and flowers. These weren't just pretty spaces, but practical ones too, providing fruit, vegetables, herbs for medicine and cooking, and materials for crafts. Some gardens featured elaborate pergolas covered with grapevines, while others included aviaries for exotic birds or enclosures for gazelles and other animals. The tools and technology that shaped the Egyptian landscape were surprisingly sophisticated. Egyptian farmers used shadoofs, counterweighted lifting devices that made it much easier to raise water from the river to higher fields. They developed improved plows, sickles, and other agricultural tools that increased productivity. In construction, they mastered techniques for quarrying, transporting, and precisely placing massive stone blocks that still puzzle modern engineers. The famous pyramids weren't just monuments, but demonstrations of Egyptian mastery over their environment. Transportation networks connected every part of Egyptian civilization. The Nile served as the main highway, with boats carrying people and goods between cities faster and more efficiently than land travel. But overland routes were important too, connecting the Nile Valley to the Red Sea, to oases in the Western Desert, and to trading partners in Nubia and the Levant. These roads were marked by way stations where travelers could find water, food, and shelter, and were patrolled by soldiers to protect against bandits. The Egyptian calendar and timekeeping reflected their intimate connection with the natural world. They based their year on the annual flood cycle, but also tracked the movements of stars and planets with remarkable accuracy. The heliacal rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the flood season and the new year. This astronomical knowledge wasn't just academic, but practical, helping farmers know when to plant and harvest, and helping priests schedule religious festivals at the proper times. Egyptian medicine and science drew heavily on their understanding of the natural world around them. Doctors used hundreds of plants and minerals as medicines, from willow bark for pain relief to honey as an antiseptic. They understood human anatomy partly through mummification practices, and their medical papyri show sophisticated knowledge of surgery, dentistry, and disease treatment. This scientific tradition was nurtured in temple schools and passed down through generations of scholar priests. The artistic and cultural life of ancient Egypt was deeply rooted in the landscape. Egyptian art is instantly recognizable, partly because it so consistently depicts the plants, animals, and scenes of daily life along the Nile. Tomb paintings show us exactly what Egyptian gardens, houses, boats, and clothing looked like. Hieroglyphic writing uses images of birds, plants, and everyday objects as symbols, creating a writing system that was itself a celebration of the Egyptian environment. By the time of the Roman conquest in 30 BCE, This remarkable landscape had supported one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations for over 3,000 years. The same annual flood cycles that had created Egyptian civilization continued to sustain millions of people, making Egypt the granary of the Roman Empire. It wasn't until the construction of modern dams in the 20th century that this ancient rhythm of flood and harvest was finally broken, ending one of humanity's longest continuous relationships between a people and their environment. The legacy of ancient Egypt's unique landscape lives on in countless ways. From the monuments that still dot the Nile Valley to the agricultural techniques still used by Egyptian farmers today. Understanding what ancient Egypt actually looked like helps us appreciate not just the achievements of this remarkable civilization, but the profound ways in which environment shapes human culture and society.